Senator Johnson, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So I'd like to start with the ongoing war in Ukraine. Back in September, more than 6 months ago, President Biden requested another $60 billion in American aid to continue to fuel that war in Ukraine. House Republicans have succeeded for 6 months now, under the leadership of Speaker Mike Johnson, in blocking that aid package. Speaker Johnson has been a longtime opponent of funding the war in Ukraine, and yet seemingly out of nowhere, by all accounts, Speaker Johnson is now assuring everybody that he will make certain that this $60 billion gets a House floor vote and will do everything he can to ensure its passage. What do you think explains the change in his posture, and what do you think is the likelihood that this $60 billion will be approved by the House?
Well, I don't want to speak for the Speaker, but I think my guess is his position has been somewhat similar to mine, that, pretty much the minute that President Biden requested the supplemental funding for the war in Ukraine, people started pointing out that we've already spent about $100 billion, and before we spend billions more on helping Ukraine secure its border, maybe we ought to turn our attention to our own wide open border. There's a clear and present danger to this nation, and any kind of funding for Ukraine must be tied to securing our own border. That's pretty much been my position. But at the same time, for more than a year, I've also been pointing out the reality situation, the sad reality, that Vladimir Putin's not going to lose this war. I don't see any strategy for Ukraine to win it. Losing the war is existential to Vladimir Putin. Russia has 4 times the population. The average fighting age, or the average age of a Ukrainian soldier, is 43 years. Vladimir Putin has the resources. I think last time I checked, oil prices are up about $20 a barrel since the war began. So he has plenty of money to fund his industrial base. They can produce 4.5 million of the 155 millimeter shells that are pretty much the weapon of choice. By the way, they produce those 4.5 million shells at a cost of $600 a shell, where the West, we can produce about 1 million shells at a cost of as high as 8,000 euros. In America, somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 per shell, 10 times more than what Russia is producing. So again, I don't see that Russia is being weakened by this. If anything, their industrial base is probably being strengthened by the war. And so I think it's just a fantasy. It's just denying reality to think that pumping more money, fueling the fire of that bloody stalemate is going to break this thing open and show that the Ukraine can be victorious. That's just not going to happen. So better to recognize reality and realize the only way the bloodshed ends is if we sit down and negotiate with Vladimir Putin. I'm not going to like the result, but every day that goes by, more Ukrainians die, more Russian conscripts die. I take no joy in that. More Ukraine gets destroyed. So the sooner the better. And I personally, I would like to have been a fly in the wall in Istanbul when they apparently were negotiating a peace agreement and the Biden administration airdropped Boris Johnson in there to blow that thing up. This is a few weeks after the war started. I think it's a tragic turn of history there.
When the first time that Congress was asked to vote on a major significant package was back in May of 2022, just a few months after the Russian invasion. The White House had requested $33 billion for Ukraine. Congress increased it $7 billion and made it $40 billion. I don't know if they were rounding up or what the rationale was, but it was a $40 billion package. And when it came to the Senate, there were 11 Republican senators who voted no. You were not one of them. You voted yes on that original aid package of $40 billion to Ukraine. What changed for you between then and now?
Well, first of all, the reason I voted for that is at least $10 billion was just replenishing our own stockpile of weapons we'd shipped over to Ukraine. Congress has no control over that. That's something that the president does on his own authority. But I was hoping at that point in time, if we would show a unified front, Russia had not successfully taken over Ukraine. They were back on their heels. They were in retreat. I was hoping that Vladimir Putin would recognize that he's not going to win this war. Again, he's not going to lose it, but I wanted to demonstrate to him that he wasn't going to win it to hopefully bring him to the negotiating table. But that's the last time I supported funding for Ukraine. As sympathetic as I am with the courageous people of Ukraine, who were invaded by Vladimir Putin, who I believe is an evil war criminal. I take no, I don't support Vladimir Putin in the slightest. But in the end, you have to recognize the reality of the situation.
Well, I realize that you don't want to speculate about Speaker Johnson and what might be motivating him in his position, but as somebody who works every day in Congress, of course you're in the Senate and this bill is in the House, but you're obviously in Washington with your finger on the pulse of what's going on. Do you expect that the House will find a way to approve the $60 billion? Do you have an expectation on that one way or the other?
Well, again, from my standpoint, I hope if they approve any funding for Ukraine, it's going to come with strong enforcement mechanisms to force President Biden to use the authority he has to secure our southern border. That's what we did not require in the Senate, tragically. But that's certainly what I would hope to see come out of the House. The rationale that people who support funding for Ukraine at this point in time use is the world is watching. President Xi's watching. Taiwan may be in play. I mean, that is the rationale. I don't necessarily buy it. I think you have to take a look at each one of these situations separately. I certainly believe that Vladimir Putin could have been deterred from invading Ukraine, probably with just a simple statement from the West, from NATO, that we were never going to allow Ukraine to join NATO. That's obviously a huge problem for Putin, which we unfortunately have just ignored at the peril of Ukraine.
Yeah, in fact, not only did we refuse to promise that Ukraine wouldn't be a part of NATO, but we made very clear that, in fact, we believe that Ukraine has the right to join NATO and should be on the path to doing so. And then last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken made one of his most declarative promises yet, standing next to the Ukrainian foreign minister at a meeting of NATO, where he said Ukraine will absolutely become part of Ukraine. You kind of indicated your view on this a little bit in the last answer, but I just want to get a better understanding for you. Do you think that American overtures to Ukraine to join NATO, the change of government that the Americans supported in 2014, where you had a democratically elected president who was a little bit more leaning toward Moscow, replaced by a pro-American government, a pro-American president, do you think that those are major factors in why Putin decided to invade Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we don't do in America is we don't look back. We don't reflect on what our foreign entanglements, what our involvement around the world has resulted. We need to retroactively do that. And when it comes to Ukraine, you need to seriously take a look at our support for the revolution of dignity. And again, we're freedom-loving people. We want to support people that want their freedom, that want to integrate with the West. But by helping foment that revolution, the result has been pretty much the destruction of Ukraine. That hasn't turned out very well. What I would do is I'd go back to, for example, the readout of the conversation that James Baker had with Mikhail Gorbachev. What happened to glasnost and perestroika? That moment when people were predicting the end of history because it was the fall of the Cold War, and James Baker was incredibly concerned about how U.S. troops in Germany would be perceived by Russia. But at the same time, Gorbachev wanted American troops there, and was it in NATO? Was it on their own, under their own authority? So they were very concerned about this. They were working cooperatively. Russia wanted to integrate with the West. It was such a hopeful time for long-term peace. What happened between then and now? We're back in this Cold War, where Vladimir Putin is threatening the use of nuclear war, or at least using theater nuclear weapons. We've obviously blown this situation, and we need to go back and recognize and analyze why. What happened? Things were so hopeful back then, and now things are looking so dark.
So I want to actually probe that a little bit, because you described, I think, very persuasively why Ukraine is very unlikely to be able to win this war, especially under the definition of victory that NATO and the United States offered, which is expelling Russian troops from every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea. I don't think anyone thinks that's possible now. The only changes to the front line in the last 18 months with all of this intense fighting and people dying have been some moderate gains for Russia, almost none for Ukraine. Ukraine faces immense challenges, a lack of artillery, also just a lack of people, a lack of soldiers to keep feeding into the front line. It's almost impossible to imagine how Ukraine can win this war. So if I know that, and you know that, obviously intelligence agencies and policymakers in Washington know that, why do you think, given that, they're still so intent on sending billions and billions and billions and keeping this war going seemingly indefinitely?
It's one of the ways that they won't have to admit that they were wrong. They won't have to explain their policy mistakes. They'll keep saying, like Schumer said when he emerged from the meeting in the White House, where they were talking about the $60 billion, he basically said, to paraphrase him, this is simple. If Ukraine gets $60 billion, they win. If they don't get $60 billion, they lose. And the first question I had is, well, how are they going to win? I have the unique perspective as I was the only member of Congress that was at Zelensky's inauguration. I went back a number of months later with Senator Chris Murphy, and we had the conversation with Zelensky. At that point in time, he wanted to do a peace deal with Putin. This is when Russia completely controlled Crimea. They were in firm control of eastern Ukraine. He knew at that time, before any war started, a couple of years before that, he knew he had no chance of dislodging Russia from those Ukrainian territories. And so he was very realistic. He understood that it wouldn't be politically popular in Ukraine, but he wanted to take that political risk and do a peace deal with Putin. So now here we are 4 years later, and they've had the war. It's decimated so much of Ukraine. We're in a bloody stalemate. It's obvious they can't win, but yet that remains the war aim of America. It makes no sense whatsoever. I think part of the problem is one of the war aims now is shifted. It's not to necessarily liberate Ukraine, but to utilize the Ukrainian people to fight a proxy war with Russia and degrade their military capability. I don't see that happening. Again, with oil prices higher, with the sanctions not working to cripple the Russian economy, I think they're just probably building up their military-industrial base, and if anything, they're getting stronger and smarter militarily.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear this argument, oh, it's a great war, we're sacrificing Ukrainian lives to weaken the Russian military, and we're not dying at all, only Ukrainians are, it seems morally dubious, to put that in the most generous terms possible. But let me ask you, you had mentioned earlier one of the arguments in favor of sending aid to Ukraine, which is the idea that if we pull out now, it will embolden the Chinese to think that they can attack Taiwan, and we don't have the will to fund the Taiwanese against against a Chinese invasion, just like we didn't have the will to keep funding the Ukrainians against a Russian invasion. But I think what you said just now is so important, which is that Zelensky has never sought a war with Russia. He was very willing, even after the Russian invasion, to negotiate with the Russians. And yet, as you said, the West came in and said, basically told them, don't negotiate. We will give you everything we will need. We will back you for as long as we have to, in order to ensure that you have what you need to fight against the Russians. So what about the argument that even though there's no strategic benefit to the United States, it's a huge waste of money, there's kind of a moral obligation to fulfill our promise to Zelensky, which led him to abandon those negotiations when we promised him that we would give the Ukrainians everything they needed until the end?
We should have made that promise. We should have, if we were concerned about the Ukrainian people, we should have taken an honest assessment of what this war was going to do to Ukraine. And it's not pretty. So, again, at some point in time, you have to recognize reality and you have to base your decisions on reality. But the Biden administration is not willing to do that. The generals aren't willing to do that because they'd have to admit they've been wrong all along.
You had said a little bit ago that one of the things you would demand at a minimum is that any attempt to continue to provide aid to Ukraine would be tied to commitments to first secure our own border. I mean, that's after all what the war in Ukraine is about, is securing the Ukrainian border against Russian encroachments. And your argument, and a lot of Republicans' argument, is, well, if we shouldn't be funding Ukrainian border security while we don't have any at all. Now, the response of the Biden administration is, we offered Republicans a hugely significant increase in border security. We made massive concessions that were going to anger immigration activists in our own party. And when we offered that, the Republicans were ready to take it. Trump came and said, don't vote for that. And that's then what made the Republicans refuse that deal. Did you think that that deal that the Biden administration offered was sufficient to secure the border in order to send aid to Ukraine?
No, first of all, none of what you just laid out there is true. It was an awful bill. It weakened presidential authority. You know, the Supreme Court in 2018.
By the way, just to be clear, I was just summarizing the Biden administration. Okay, go ahead. I just want to make sure.
You know, I'm not accusing you. I'm just saying, you know, by laying out what they're saying, none of that stuff is true. But in 2018, the Supreme Court ruled that, or stated that existing immigration law exudes deference to the executive branch. Now, that authority, presidential authority, has been diminished because of a couple of court cases. But even with that diminished presidential authority, President Trump secured the border. Using that exact same presidential authority, President Biden opened up the border. So he has the authority. Nobody in the Republican conference, other than Mitch McConnell, was looking for an immigration bill. We were looking for, knowing that this is a lawless administration, a president that ignores Supreme Court rulings. We were looking for some enforcement mechanism to force him to use the authority he has. If he wanted strengthened authority, we would have done that. The biggest problem with that bill wasn't the threshold at 5,000 a day, which is, again, it's a massive normalization of immigration. It was the 4,000 limit, which said the president then had the discretion to stop processing asylum claims. Well, if we were to pass that law, that would imply the president doesn't have that discretion currently. And I would argue he did. And even worse, that discretion ended after 3 years. So the bill that McConnell negotiated, I know he used James Langford, but this was Mitch McConnell. That's what Senator Murphy said. His staff's in the room. Mitch made the decision. This was Mitch's bill. It would have been worse than doing nothing from a standpoint of weakening a serious president's authority, who somebody who wanted to actually secure the border. So that bill was awful. It killed itself. I'm not aware. President Trump never called me. I'm not aware that President Trump called anybody and told them not to vote for that bill. Again, within 24 hours, even Mitch McConnell voted against that awful bill once all these things were pointed out to him. So again, I realize the Democrats use that as political cover. I think that's unfortunate. The truth of the matter is President Biden wants an open border. Democrats in Congress want an open border. They caused this. They weren't negotiating in good faith. They were just negotiating for political cover. And unfortunately, Mitch McConnell gave them political cover to a certain extent.
I don't know if you saw this, but when the United States withdrew from Afghanistan under President Biden, only to watch the Taliban march right back into power. We spent 20 years there, $2 trillion on those wars, only to see the Taliban march back into power like it was 2001. The Chinese government released a video basically mocking the United States for constantly using its money on an endless number of foreign wars, and they pointed out that while the U.S. was fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, going into debt to do it, the Chinese, who haven't fought a war since 1979, spent $800 billion to build a high-speed rail system connecting all of China to itself, and it obviously helps trade, helps the population in all sorts of ways. Do you think there is a significant connection between how many wars the United States fights or finances on the one hand and the standard of living for Americans at home?
Well, let me also point out China's also done deals, built ports for countries all over the world to improve their access to natural resources. So again, while we've been spending money on endless wars, they've been building up their own infrastructure and building up infrastructure for global partners. So no, this is the point I'm making, that we need to look in hindsight with some serious retrospection and say, what have all these foreign entanglements gotten for us? I think one of the best books on Afghanistan I read was written by a couple special operations personnel who said we'd pretty well done what we needed to do in Afghanistan in reaction to 9/11 before Tommy Frank ever put a boot on the ground. We certainly shown the Taliban, you better not be harboring Al Qaeda, people like Osama bin Laden. We might have, it might have made sense to establish a Bagram Air Force Base and keep that as a listening post. We certainly should have maintained that, having invested 20 years of treasure and blood of Americans. We probably should have at least maintained that to provide the Afghan security forces the support they're going to need to keep the Taliban at bay. But we didn't do that. We just bugged out an embarrassing and dangerous surrender in Afghanistan. But we had Condoleezza Rice in front of our Senate lunch, and I asked her, does she ever look back in hindsight and take a look at what has been the result of Afghanistan and Iraq? And of course, she said everything's coming up roses. I don't agree. Go back to Vietnam. Go back to all these foreign entanglements. And I think a sober and honest assessment has to be they haven't resulted in what we actually wanted. These have been a disaster for America. It has weakened America. And of course, that's winds up happening to empires, to republics. They more often rot from within, and they rot from overextending themselves more often than through foreign invasion.
Just a couple more questions. This rationale that you just laid out, that you've laid out in other answers as well about Ukraine, namely that we're pouring money that we don't have, that would be better served at home to secure the border, to build our infrastructure, to improve the lives of the American people, would be better spent at home, not constantly financing foreign wars like the one in Ukraine. In addition to financing Ukraine's war, we are also currently financing Israel's. We're providing them with all of the arms they need. We give them $4 billion every year. Whenever they have a war, we pay a lot of money, many billions of dollars on top of that $4 billion we give them every year to finance their war. I understand that you're a supporter of Israel, but do you see at least the validity of the view that that same rationale applies to the way in which the United States finances Israel's wars, given that there are millions of Israelis who have a higher standard of living than millions of Americans?
First, let me back up. I wouldn't spend that money we spent on the endless wars here in America. I would just not spend it. One of the things that's weakening America is we're almost $35 trillion in debt. Biden's just put forward a budget that will increase debt by $16 trillion over the next 10 years. Not one year's deficit is projected to be under $1.5 trillion. Again, that is what is weakening America. You achieve peace through strength, but it starts with economic strength. And you can't be strong economically if you completely indebted your nation and weakened your currency. When it comes to Israel, again, we want to support people who desire freedom, that want to fight for their freedom. I think that's certainly the description of Israel. Hamas broke the ceasefire in a most horrible and brutal and horrific way. If you compare what Hamas did to Israel, percentage population, that'd be basically the equivalent of a terrorist attack killing 50,000 Americans. You can imagine what the American public would demand there. So right now, listen, I am concerned about civilian casualties in any war. I hate war. It needs to be avoided. But when somebody starts a war, eventually have to finish it off. And I understand exactly the Israelis' public, their desire to destroy Hamas so they don't have to be facing that threat in the future.
Oh, absolutely. I understand the Israeli view. The question is, why can't the Israelis pay for their war? Why should Americans pay for Israel's military and its wars?
Listen, I think that's a fair point. What we do supply Israel with is, in terms of our budget, not particularly large. It does send, I think, a solid signal that we want to support Israel, hopefully keep people at bay. Again, that's peace through strength. You're showing strength when you show you that kind of support for an ally. So, again, you can quibble with that fact, but again, the dollar amount that we commit to Israel, I don't think is a particularly large amount that impacts our budget deficits very significantly.
Last question, just out of respect for your time. I have a ton more I'd love to talk to you about, but I'm going to make this last question. We'd love to have you back on sometime. If you look at polling of Americans consistently for almost 20 years now, they, across the spectrum, left, right, center, say that they are tired of endless wars, that they want the United States to pay more attention to our own country and less attention and involvement in foreign wars. And yet it seems like the United States always finds new wars to get involved in. We pulled out of Afghanistan. It was barely 6 months that went by when we were heavily involved in the war in Ukraine. I realized Russia invaded, but we decided to get involved in that war. Donald Trump ran on a platform in 2016 and won on this idea that we need to be much less involved in the conflicts and internal affairs of foreign countries, and we always seem to be. One of the more cynical views is that one reason that happens is because war is a very profitable business for a lot of very powerful corporations, arms dealers, Boeing, that wield a lot of power in Washington, that fund both political parties, and therefore wield a lot of influence to keep this military-industrial complex, to use Eisenhower's terms, very well funded. Without delving into sort of a conspiracy theory, just like basic notions of lobbying power and corporate power inside Washington, do you think that's one of the reasons why we always are involved in so many wars?
First of all, I don't think that's a cynical assessment. I think that's a very accurate assessment. I don't think we heeded Eisenhower's warning nearly as much as we should have. I think the military-industrial complex drives so much of what we're experiencing here today, the endless wars. Again, I can't tell you, how many governments we have, through covert action, how many governments we've overturned. What's been the net result of that? There's some very interesting books. JFK and the Unspeakables, The Devil's Chessboard, talking about Allen Dulles' CIA. Again, you read our history and you really come away scratching your head. That's why I'm talking about looking back at history, doing an honest assessment of what all of our foreign entanglements have resulted in. It's not a pretty assessment. It's not going to show that we've done the right thing. We've probably done the wrong thing time and time again. Again, I'm somebody that loves this country. I think the American people are good, but I think we've been grossly misserved by our government in so many cases. And certainly in one aspect, it's in terms of our foreign entanglements, which our founding fathers tried to get us to avoid. They were very skeptical of foreign entanglements, tried to do everything they could to avoid them. We unfortunately haven't done that. We should.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear that critique, which I recommend The Devil's Chessboard all the time, coming increasingly from conservatives and from Republicans, while Democrats increasingly seem to be far more united in support of the U.S. security state, foreign wars, and the like. That realignment that I think Trump had a lot to do with is very fascinating. I think one of the most important political developments. I really appreciate this conversation. I think it was incredibly interesting. We'd love to have you back on, but thanks for coming on tonight.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and I'm always happy to come back on.
Great. Nice seeing you. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.